Mark Williams was a man who prided himself on his strong work ethic and dedication to his family. In his late 30s, he had worked tirelessly as an accountant, trying to make ends meet for his wife, Emma, and their two children, Lily and Jason. The family had been through tough financial times in recent months, and while they weren't exactly in crisis, they were far from comfortable. Bills had been piling up, and Mark had been putting in extra hours at work, hoping to catch up. But even with all his efforts, they were barely scraping by. Emma, always a supportive partner, offered to help. One evening, while they sat together at the kitchen table balancing their expenses, she brought up an idea that, at first, seemed sensible. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft but determined. "I could get a part-time job to help with the bills. Nothing major, just something to bring in a little extra money." Mark hesitated. The thought of Emma working made him uneasy, not because he didn't think she could handle it, but because he didn't want her to feel the burden of their financial struggles. Yet, he couldn't argue with her logic. A second income, even a small one, would help lighten the load. "Where would you work?" Mark asked, trying to sound supportive while suppressing his reluctance. "There's a bar near the town center that's looking for part-time help," Emma replied. "It's not glamorous, but it's good money. Plus, I'll only be working a few nights a week, so it won't interfere too much with things at home." Though Mark wasn't thrilled with the idea of his wife working in a bar, he couldn't deny they needed the money. So, reluctantly, he agreed. "Okay, if you think it's a good idea," he said with a small smile. "I trust you." Emma's new job as a waitress at the local bar started smoothly. She would work a few nights a week, coming home late but always cheerful. At first, Mark was grateful for the extra income. Their bank account began to look healthier, and Emma seemed to enjoy the work. She would come home with stories about rowdy patrons and friendly coworkers, always laughing and brushing off any discomfort she might have faced during her shifts. But over time, something began to change. It wasn't one big event that triggered Mark's suspicion. It was a series of small things, seemingly insignificant on their own, but when pieced together, they started to gnaw at him. Emma had become more secretive, often glancing at her phone during dinner, quickly putting it away when Mark or the kids noticed. When Mark asked about her shifts, her answers were always vague, lacking the usual detail she had once provided about her night at work. "Busy night?" Mark asked casually one evening as Emma came home later than usual. "Yeah," she said, her voice a little too quick. "It was packed, and I had to stay late to help clean up." Mark nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He brushed it off initially, thinking it was just his own stress from work getting the better of him. But as the weeks passed, the feeling grew stronger. One night, while Emma was working, Mark decided to do some investigating of his own. He knew the bar Emma worked at, but he had never looked into it in detail. On a whim, he decided to search for the place online. He found the bar's website and social media pages and started scrolling through the reviews. Most of them were about the drinks and atmosphere, but one review caught his eye. It was from a man who mentioned how some of the waitresses offered extra services after hours. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Surely this didn't involve Emma, he thought. She was just there to wait tables and make some extra money for the family. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, he couldn't shake it. A few days later, Mark's suspicion deepened. Emma had come home late again, and while she was in the shower, Mark noticed a receipt sticking out of her purse. He wasn't one to snoop, but his curiosity got the better of him. He pulled out the receipt and his eyes widened when he saw the amount. It was from an upscale hotel in the city, far more than what Emma could afford on her bar wages. She hadn't mentioned anything about staying at a hotel. Mark's mind raced. Why would she be at a hotel? Was it for work? Was she meeting someone? He felt a pang of guilt for doubting her, but the evidence was piling up. He needed to know more. As the days went by, Mark found himself growing more distant from Emma. He hated the feeling of suspicion, but he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The late nights, the expensive purchases, and the vague explanations. It all pointed to something more than just waitressing. One night, as Emma prepared to leave for another shift, Mark couldn't help but ask, "Are you sure you're just working at the bar, Emma?" She paused, surprised by the question, then gave him a reassuring smile. "Of course, Mark. Why would you even ask that?" Mark forced a smile, but inside, the doubt only grew stronger. Something wasn't right, and he was determined to find out the truth. The following week, Mark's unease grew. Despite Emma's attempts to keep their household running smoothly, her behavior became harder to ignore. Every night, after coming home from her bar shifts, she would seem a little more distant, a little more secretive. She was still the loving wife he knew, but there was something behind her eyes that felt different. One night, after she came home later than usual, Mark noticed Emma had been particularly evasive during their conversations. She was always good at deflecting when asked about her shifts, but this time, it was almost as if she had rehearsed her responses. She quickly shut down any questions with curt replies like, "It was busy," or "the usual crowd." She rarely made eye contact during these moments, and Mark couldn't help but feel a growing disconnect between them. What bothered Mark the most was how the little things had started to change. The warmth and familiarity that had once filled their relationship seemed to be slipping away. They still shared moments together, but those moments were now filled with more silence than usual, more unanswered questions. He wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, but every time she left for work, a gnawing sensation tugged at him. It was a Tuesday night when everything began to escalate. Mark had just put the kids to bed and was flipping through the TV channels, absent-mindedly waiting for Emma to come home. She had texted earlier, saying she would be late again due to a last-minute rush at the bar. It was the fourth time that week she had stayed late, and while she usually worked only 3 shifts, she had picked up an extra one. "More money, right?" she had said cheerfully. But the way she avoided his gaze when saying it stuck with him. As Mark sat in the dimly lit living room, he heard the faint buzz of Emma's phone. She had left it on the kitchen counter before heading out. Normally, Mark wouldn't have given it much thought, but tonight, curiosity got the better of him. He glanced over at the phone, hesitating for a moment before getting up and walking to the counter. The screen lit up with a notification, a message from an unknown number. "Can you meet tomorrow? Usual time?" it read. Mark stared at it, his pulse quickening. The message wasn't casual, like something from a friend or even a work-related text. It was brief, vague, and unsettling. Mark hesitated, torn between respecting Emma's privacy and the growing pit of suspicion in his stomach. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the phone, debating whether to unlock it. He knew Emma's password. It was their wedding anniversary. He hadn't ever thought about checking her phone before, but tonight was different. The phone unlocked with a quiet click, and Mark's heart raced as he scrolled through the recent messages. Most were harmless, from friends or family, but the same unknown number kept appearing. Short, cryptic messages about meeting up, times, and locations. The messages weren't detailed enough to confirm anything, but they were frequent, and they felt intimate. One message stood out: "Thanks for last night. I had a great time." Mark's blood ran cold. He couldn't believe what he was reading. Who was this person? What did they mean by last night? His mind raced, piecing together the scattered clues he had noticed over the past few weeks. The late nights, the hotel receipt, the expensive shopping, and now these messages. His first instinct was to call the number, but he stopped himself. He needed more information before confronting Emma. If he acted too soon, she might deny everything or find a way to explain it away. Mark didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was becoming too much to ignore. He had to be sure. Over the next few days, Mark kept a close eye on Emma's behavior. She was still her usual self in many ways, caring with the kids, smiling when they were together, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a facade. She was hiding something, and he needed to know what it was. Then came the night of the call. It was a Friday evening, and Emma had gone to work for her usual shift. Mark was sitting on the couch, staring at the phone in his hands. He had been thinking about it for days now, contemplating what to do. His mind kept circling back to one idea: calling the unknown number himself. The idea felt risky, but Mark was desperate. He needed answers, and waiting for Emma to slip up didn't seem like it would happen anytime soon. After a long debate with himself, he made the decision. He opened a new burner phone he had bought earlier in the day. If Emma was hiding something, she wouldn't recognize this number. With his heart pounding in his chest, he dialed the unknown number and waited. 1 ring, 2 rings. Then, a voice on the other end. "Hello?" It was a man's voice. Mark's grip tightened around the phone, his mouth suddenly dry. He hadn't expected to hear a man's voice, though he couldn't say why. He struggled to find the right words. "Hi, is this the number that usually meets Emma?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a pause on the other end. "Who is this?" Mark didn't answer, his heart racing even faster now. The man on the other end hung up abruptly, leaving Mark with more questions than answers. Who was this man? Why was Emma meeting him? The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was one Mark didn't want to see. He sat back, the phone still clutched in his hand. His thoughts were swirling, a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. He couldn't confront Emma yet. He needed more information. But the reality was becoming harder to deny. His wife was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Later that night, as Mark sat in the dimly lit kitchen, Emma came home. She looked exhausted, her hair slightly disheveled, and there was a faint hint of perfume that Mark didn't recognize. She smiled tiredly at him, setting her purse down on the counter. "How was your shift?" Mark asked, keeping his voice casual. "Busy, as usual," she replied, not meeting his gaze as she grabbed a glass of water. Mark nodded, watching her closely. The distance between them was palpable now, the tension thick in the air. He wanted to ask her about the unknown number, the hotel receipt, the messages, but he couldn't, not yet. As Emma made her way to bed, Mark remained in the kitchen, staring at the phone in his hand. His mind was filled with questions, but one thing was certain. His marriage was no longer what he thought it was, and he needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Mark's mind was in a fog for days after that unsettling phone call. The voice on the other end haunted him, a shadow looming over every conversation with Emma. He couldn't focus at work, barely slept, and felt the tension growing in every part of his life. He needed to know what was going on. He needed proof. It was time to stop speculating and start investigating. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark began by digging deeper into Emma's phone. Late at night, when she was asleep, he would quietly retrieve it from her purse and check for any new messages from the unknown number. She had become more cautious, deleting most of the conversations after receiving them, but Mark was able to recover some of them using a recovery app. The texts were cryptic, but clear enough to indicate that Emma had been meeting someone after work, someone who wasn't just another customer. One particular message caught his eye. "Same place as usual tonight?" Mark felt his stomach twist. He had no idea where the usual place was, but he was determined to find out. That night, after Emma left for her shift at the bar, Mark made a decision. He would follow her. Dressed in dark clothes, he waited until Emma had been gone for about an hour before grabbing his car keys and heading out. His hands were shaking as he started the engine, the fear of what he might discover gnawing at him. He wasn't sure how far she'd go, or if she would catch him following her, but he knew he couldn't sit at home any longer, wondering what she was up to. Mark drove slowly, keeping a few cars behind Emma as she made her way across town. She took an unexpected turn away from the bar, heading toward the outskirts of the city. His heart pounded as he carefully kept his distance, doing his best to stay unnoticed. Emma's car eventually pulled into the parking lot of a small, upscale hotel, far from where she should have been working. He parked a distance away, his mind racing with questions. Why was she here? Who was she meeting? Mark took out his phone and quickly snapped a few pictures of her entering the hotel. He needed evidence, something concrete, in case she tried to deny it later. But he wasn't ready to confront her just yet. He needed more. Determined to gather all the proof he could, Mark returned home, his thoughts in turmoil. This was it. Emma wasn't just working late. She was meeting someone. But who? And why? He couldn't stop until he had the answers. The next night, Mark set a new plan in motion. If Emma had gone to that hotel once, she'd probably go there again. He needed to set a trap, something that would confirm his suspicions without her knowing. Using a burner phone, Mark decided to send her a text, posing as a wealthy client from her bar. He kept it simple, offering a large sum of money for a private meeting at the same hotel. He crafted the message carefully, making it sound like one of her regular clients. "Can you meet at the Grandview Hotel tonight? I'll make it worth your while." His heart raced as he hit send. Minutes passed, then an hour, with no response. He began to wonder if she had caught on, or if maybe she was too busy with whoever she was already meeting. Just as he was about to give up, his phone buzzed. Emma had replied, "Sorry, I can't tonight. Something came up. Maybe next time?" Mark's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't available tonight. That meant she was already booked. He was both relieved and devastated. It was confirmation that something was going on, but he still didn't have the final piece of evidence he needed. Determined not to waste the opportunity, Mark drove to the hotel anyway, hoping to catch Emma in the act. But when he arrived, he found no trace of her. Instead, there was another woman, someone he didn't recognize, who seemed to be filling in for the meeting he had arranged. His heart sank. Emma had sent a replacement, covering her tracks yet again. Defeated, Mark returned home. Every step of his investigation brought him closer to the truth, but Emma was always one step ahead, skillfully avoiding being caught red-handed. It was like she knew how to walk the line just close enough without tipping over. She never gave him enough proof to directly accuse her, yet the evidence kept piling up in his mind. Back at home, Mark confronted Emma lightly, testing the waters. "How was your night?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, just busy," Emma replied, the same rehearsed smile on her face. "The usual crowd. Nothing special." Mark nodded, his heart sinking deeper. Every time she lied, it was like a knife twisting in his chest. She was skillful in her deflections, keeping her responses vague enough to avoid giving anything away. But Mark could see through it now. The hotel, the texts, the late nights, it was all starting to make sense. She wasn't just working extra shifts at the bar. She had a secret life that she was hiding from him, and no matter how much he wanted to deny it, the truth was becoming clearer with each passing day. Mark knew he had to confront her soon. The trap had been set, but it had only confirmed what he feared. Emma was involved in something deeper than just bartending, and it was only a matter of time before the full truth would come out. But when it did, Mark knew his life would never be the same. Mark's hands trembled as he sat in the living room, the weight of his suspicions crushing him. He had seen enough. Emma's late nights, the strange texts, her secret meetings at upscale hotels. He had followed her, set traps, but every time she slipped away, dodging the truth with the grace of someone skilled in deception. The evidence pointed toward betrayal, but she was so good at leaving just enough doubt to make him question his own sanity. Tonight would be different, he decided. He couldn't take it anymore. The lying, the secrets, it was eating him alive. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Emma was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared dinner. Mark watched her from the doorway, his heart pounding. She seemed so calm, so normal, as if nothing was wrong. But Mark knew better now. Every time she smiled at him, every time she kissed him goodnight, it felt like a lie. And tonight, he was going to confront her, once and for all. "Emma," Mark said, his voice strained as he stepped into the kitchen. She turned, her smile bright as always, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, honey, how was your day?" Mark swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to talk." Emma paused, her hands stilling over the salad she was chopping. "Sure," she said, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it fear? Or just surprise? "What's on your mind?" Mark took a deep breath, his fists clenching at his sides. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head 1,000 times, but now that the moment was here, the words felt stuck in his throat. "I know about the hotels, Emma." For a split second, Emma froze. Her face betrayed nothing, but her hands tensed slightly around the knife. "What are you talking about?" Mark's eyes locked onto hers, searching for any sign of guilt, but Emma was calm. Too calm. "Don't lie to me, Emma. I followed you. I saw you at the Grandview Hotel. I know you weren't at the bar like you said." Emma blinked, her face smooth as she set the knife down on the counter. "Mark, I don't know what you're talking about. I was working, like I always do. You must have misunderstood something." Mark felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Don't play games with me. I saw the texts, the messages from that guy asking to meet you. I even sent you a message myself, pretending to be a client. You sent someone else in your place. Just admit it, Emma." For the first time, Emma's calm facade cracked. Her lips parted, and she took a step back, her eyes widening ever so slightly. But she recovered quickly, her face hardening into something cold and unrecognizable. Mark, you've completely lost it. Are you seriously following me? Checking my phone? What's wrong with you? Her voice rose in pitch, turning defensive, and Mark could feel the argument slipping out of his control. She was turning it back on him, making him out to be the one at fault. But he wouldn't let her win this time. He couldn't. I'm not the one sneaking off to hotels and meeting strange men, Mark shouted, his frustration boiling over. I've given you every chance to tell me the truth, and you just keep lying. I deserve to know what's going on. Emma crossed her arms, her expression icy. You're paranoid, Mark. I'm working extra shifts at the bar because we need the money. You know that. I don't know what kind of crazy ideas you've been cooking up in your head, but I'm not doing anything wrong. Mark's mind was spinning. She was so good at this, twisting the narrative, making him feel like the one who was being unreasonable. But he knew what he had seen. He knew the truth, even if she refused to admit it. You were at the hotel, Mark said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I followed you, Emma. I saw you go inside. If there's nothing going on, then why are you sneaking around? Emma's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing. You really want to know, she snapped. Fine. Yes, I went to the hotel. But it's not what you think. I've been doing private bartending gigs on the side, and some of those clients prefer meeting in more discreet locations. It's nothing shady, I promise. Mark stared at her, trying to process her words. Private bartending gigs? In hotels? It sounded plausible, but something about it didn't sit right with him. Could it really be that simple? And the messages? He asked, still skeptical. The ones thanking you for last night? Emma sighed, rubbing her temples as if exhausted by the conversation. Mark, those are clients. Some of them get a little too familiar, but it's just part of the job. You're overthinking everything. Mark's anger wavered, replaced by a crushing sense of doubt. Was he really overreacting? Had he misinterpreted everything? Emma was standing there, calm and composed, while he felt like his world was falling apart. But then he remembered the pictures, the ones he had taken of her entering the hotel. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photos, holding them up for her to see. If it's nothing, then explain this. Emma's eyes flickered to the screen, and for the briefest moment, her expression faltered. But then she straightened, her gaze hardening once more. You're stalking me now? Taking pictures of me behind my back? I don't even know who you are anymore, Mark. The accusation stung, and Mark felt the wind knocked out of him. Emma's deflection was cutting deep, making him feel like he was the villain in this scenario. She was expertly turning the conversation away from her actions and placing all the blame on him. I don't want to live like this, Emma said, her voice suddenly soft and full of emotion. If you can't trust me, then maybe we need to think about where this relationship is going. Mark was speechless. The confrontation had completely derailed, and now it was him standing there, feeling like the guilty party. Emma had dodged every accusation with skill, leaving him with nothing concrete. He had set a trap, but she had slipped through it effortlessly. With a heavy heart, Mark realized he wasn't going to get the answers he needed tonight. Emma was too good at covering her tracks, and he didn't have enough proof to push her further. He could feel the distance between them growing, but the truth remained just out of reach. As Emma walked past him to head upstairs, Mark stood frozen in place, watching her retreating figure. His gut told him she was lying, but his heart was too battered to keep fighting. For now, the confrontation had failed, but the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. Days passed after the confrontation, and Mark felt like he was living in a fog. The tension between him and Emma had reached an unbearable level, yet she acted like nothing had happened. She continued her routine, working late, coming home tired, and slipping into bed without another word about their confrontation. Mark, however, was far from at peace. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something, some critical piece of evidence that could confirm his worst fears. Every conversation with Emma felt like a dance, her careful words, her well-placed deflections. She had become a master at dodging the truth, leaving Mark frustrated and confused. He still didn't know the full extent of what she was hiding, but he was determined to find out. There was no going back now. He needed the truth, no matter how painful it might be. One evening, as Emma prepared to leave for another late shift, Mark watched her closely. She was dressed a little nicer than usual, her makeup perfectly done, and her perfume lingering in the air longer than he remembered. He didn't say anything, but the knots in his stomach tightened. Something about tonight felt different. As soon as Emma left the house, Mark's eyes flicked to her purse, sitting on the kitchen counter. He had checked her phone before and found nothing but carefully cleaned messages, but tonight, he had a different plan. Over the past few days, Mark had been quietly observing Emma's behavior, and something strange had caught his attention. She rarely used her phone in front of him anymore. In fact, she often left it in the kitchen while they were together, which seemed odd for someone who used to be glued to it. Mark walked over to her purse, his heart racing. He had no idea what he was looking for, but a gut feeling told him that something was hidden in plain sight. Carefully, he unzipped the bag and sifted through it. Wallet, makeup, receipts. Nothing unusual at first glance. But then, tucked inside a side pocket, he felt something hard and unfamiliar. His fingers brushed against it, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a second phone. Mark pulled it out slowly, staring at the small, sleek device in his hand. His mind raced with possibilities. Why would Emma have a second phone? She had never mentioned it, and there was no reason for her to have one. At least, none that she had told him. His hands shook as he pressed the power button, and the screen flickered to life. Unlike her main phone, this one wasn't locked. Mark felt a surge of adrenaline as the home screen opened, revealing a series of messages, emails, and missed calls. His pulse quickened as he scrolled through the texts. There were messages from the same unknown number he had seen on her other phone, the one he had called from the burner phone. But now, there were more details, more pieces of the puzzle that Emma had been hiding. One message stood out immediately. Looking forward to tonight. Usual spot? Mark's breath caught in his throat. There it was, plain as day, a message confirming another secret meeting. He scrolled through more texts, his heart sinking with every word. There were exchanges about hotel rooms, times, and payments. The language was careful, vague, but unmistakable. Whoever Emma was meeting wasn't just a client from the bar. This was something far more personal and far more damning. One message sent a chill down his spine. Thanks for last night. You were amazing, as always. Mark's mind went blank for a moment. He stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, the weight of the phone suddenly unbearable. This was it. The proof he had been looking for. Emma wasn't just hiding something. She was living an entirely separate life, one that involved secret meetings, intimate encounters, and lies upon lies. As he scrolled further, the messages revealed even more. Emma had been meeting this person for months, possibly even longer. The messages went back weeks, detailing late-night rendezvous, payments, and coded language that Mark now understood all too well. He felt sick to his stomach. But it wasn't just the messages that confirmed everything. There were pictures, too. Attached to several of the texts were photos of Emma in various hotel rooms, dressed provocatively, smiling into the camera. These were not the kind of pictures someone took for professional reasons. They were intimate, personal, and completely shattering to Mark. Mark sank into a chair, the phone still clutched in his hand. He couldn't breathe. The reality of Emma's betrayal crashed down on him, wave after wave of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. He had suspected for so long, but now that he had the proof, it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. How could she have hidden this from him for so long? How could she look him in the eye every day and pretend everything was fine? His mind raced with memories of their life together, their wedding day, the birth of their children, the quiet nights spent on the couch watching movies. All of it now felt like a lie, tainted by the secret life she had been leading. Mark wanted to confront her right then and there, to throw the phone in her face and demand an explanation. But he knew he had to stay calm. If he exploded now, he might never get the full story. Instead, Mark took pictures of the messages and the photos, backing up everything on his own phone. He needed this evidence, something solid, something Emma couldn't deny or twist into another story. Once he had the proof secured, he carefully placed the second phone back in her purse, just as he had found it. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. He knew Emma would be home in a few hours, and when she walked through the door, everything would change. But for now, Mark sat in the quiet of the kitchen, the weight of the truth heavy on his shoulders. He had finally uncovered Emma's secret, but it didn't bring the relief he had expected. Instead, it left him hollow, broken, and unsure of what to do next. The second phone had confirmed his worst fears, but now came the hardest part, deciding what to do with the truth. The house was eerily silent when Emma returned home later that night. Mark sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of the overhead light casting long shadows across the room. He had been sitting there for hours, waiting, thinking, and feeling the weight of everything that had come crashing down on him earlier. The second phone, the messages, the photos, it had all been so clear. There was no more room for denial. As the door creaked open, Emma stepped inside, her usual smile plastered on her face. She slipped off her shoes and dropped her purse on the counter. "Hey," she said, her voice tired but warm, as if it were just another normal night. "Long shift. I'm exhausted." Mark didn't respond. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on the table in front of him, but his mind was racing with everything he had uncovered. He had rehearsed this moment in his head, how he would confront her, how he would demand the truth. But now, sitting there, the words felt heavy and impossible to speak. Emma sensed the tension immediately. Her smile faded, and her eyes narrowed as she walked closer. "Mark, are you okay?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He just sat there, his mind playing over the past few hours, over everything he had discovered. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze and met her eyes. The weight of his stare was enough to make Emma stop in her tracks. "Sit down," Mark said, his voice low and strained. There was no anger in it, no explosion, just a quiet, simmering pain. Emma blinked, confused by his tone, but she pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "What's going on?" Mark didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he opened the gallery where he had saved the pictures and screenshots from Emma's second phone. He slid the phone across the table toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Explain this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's eyes widened as she glanced down at the phone, her face paling as she saw the images. The messages, the photos of her in hotel rooms, the text exchanges, everything was laid bare in front of her. For the first time since Mark had started suspecting, Emma's composure cracked. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes darted up to meet his, full of shock and panic. "Mark, Don't," Mark interrupted, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Don't lie to me anymore. I know everything." Emma's eyes filled with tears, her voice faltering as she tried to find the right words. I can explain." "Explain what?" Mark snapped, his voice rising. "That you've been sneaking around behind my back? That you've been meeting men at hotels while I've been here, working my ass off for this family? How long, Emma? How long have you been lying to me?" Emma's tears spilled over, and she reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Mark, please, it's not what you think." Mark pulled his hand away from hers, shaking his head in disbelief. "Not what I think. I've seen the messages, Emma. I've seen the pictures. You've been cheating on me, and now you're going to stand there and tell me it's not what I think." Emma's voice cracked as she tried to respond. "It's not like that, I swear. It's complicated." "Complicated?" Mark let out a bitter laugh, leaning back in his chair. "Complicated? Is that what you call it? What about us? What about our family? Was that not enough for you?" Emma wiped her tears, struggling to find her voice. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. It started out as a way to make extra money for us. For the family." Mark's head snapped up, disbelief written all over his face. "For us? You've been sneaking off to hotels with other men for us?" "I didn't want to tell you," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep it separate from our life, from our family. I didn't want you to worry about the money." Mark slammed his fist on the table, making Emma jump. "You didn't want me to worry?" "Emma, I've been worried for weeks. You've been lying to me every single day, And now you're trying to justify it by saying it was for us? I didn't know what else to do. Emma cried, her voice breaking. We were drowning, Mark. The bills, the house, the kids. I thought I could help. And then things just got out of control. Mark shook his head, his heart breaking as he looked at the woman he had once trusted more than anyone in the world. So, what? You just thought you could cheat on me and pretend everything was fine? That I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't find out? Emma sobbed, her face crumbling. I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt you. Mark felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words suffocating him. But you did, Emma. You did hurt me. You lied to me, over and over again. I don't even know who you are anymore. Emma looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. I love you, Mark. I swear, I never stopped loving you. Mark's heart shattered at her words, but he couldn't bring himself to believe them. Not anymore. Love? This isn't love, Emma. What you've done. It's destroyed everything we had. Silence filled the room as Emma sobbed quietly, her hands trembling as she tried to reach out to him again. Please, please don't leave me. Mark stood, pushing the chair back as he took a step away from the table. His mind was a whirlwind of pain, anger, and confusion. I don't know what to do, he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. I don't know how to move forward from this. Emma stood as well, her tears streaming down her face. We can fix this. I'll stop. I swear. I'll stop everything. We can fix it, Mark. We can start over. Mark stared at her, the woman he had once thought he'd spend the rest of his life with, and felt nothing but emptiness. I don't think we can fix this, he said quietly, his voice hollow. Without another word, Mark turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Emma standing there in tears. He needed space. He needed to think. But most of all, he needed to figure out whether there was anything left to salvage in the ruins of their marriage. Mark stood on the porch, the cold night air biting at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was too clouded with everything that had just transpired in the kitchen. Emma's confession had shattered whatever thin hope he had left, and now, as he stared out into the darkness, he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. Inside, Emma remained in the kitchen, her quiet sobs drifting faintly through the open door. Mark could feel the weight of her grief, but it was distant now, like a sound from another world. He leaned against the railing, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. For weeks, he had suspected. For weeks, he had gathered evidence, each new discovery adding to the pain and confusion. And now, finally, he had the truth. But instead of relief, all he felt was emptiness. How did they get here? How did the life they had built together crumble so completely? Mark's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number, one he recognized instantly as the same burner phone he had used to set the trap for Emma. Confused, he opened the message. It was a short, cryptic text. You weren't supposed to find out this way. Mark's heart stopped. His mind raced as he stared at the screen, his blood running cold. Was this a mistake? Who could have sent this? And what did they mean? This way? Suddenly, everything felt wrong. There was something else going on, something he hadn't seen yet. His fingers trembling, Mark texted back, "Who is this?" There was a pause, and then another message appeared. "You've only seen part of the picture. It's bigger than you think." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't wrap his mind around it. Was this just another lie? Another manipulation? He thought he had uncovered everything, thought Emma's betrayal was the end of it. But now, something far darker was starting to unfold. Before he could respond, another message appeared. "Meet me at the Grandview Hotel, room 210, if you want the whole truth." Mark stood frozen, staring at the screen, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. His first instinct was to delete the message, to ignore it. He had been through enough already, hadn't he? He had uncovered Emma's infidelity. What more could there be? But something deep inside him, a mix of curiosity and dread, pushed him to go. Maybe this was just a game, another way for someone to mess with him. Or maybe there was something he hadn't seen yet, some final piece of the puzzle. He needed to know. Without a word, Mark went back inside. Emma was still sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. She didn't look up as he grabbed his jacket and keys. Mark paused for a moment, looking at her, torn between his anger and his lingering love for the woman he thought he knew. But whatever emotions remained were buried under the need for answers. "I'll be back," he said quietly, his voice void of any warmth. Emma didn't respond, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mark left the house and drove to the hotel, his heart pounding with every passing mile. When he arrived at the Grandview, he parked and sat in the car for a few moments, his eyes locked on the entrance. Room 210. Whoever had sent him the message was waiting. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Finally, Mark gathered the courage to step out of the car and walk inside. He made his way to the second floor, the echo of his footsteps in the empty hallway heightening the tension in his chest. Room 210 stood before him, the door slightly ajar. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. Inside, sitting calmly at the edge of the bed, was a man he didn't recognize. His face was unfamiliar, but the look in his eyes was not. It was a cold, calculating gaze, one that sent a chill down Mark's spine. "You're Mark," the man said, his voice smooth and detached. "I've been expecting you." Mark clenched his fists. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man smiled faintly, leaning forward. "I'm the one Emma's been seeing. But it's more than that. She wasn't working for herself, Mark. She's been working for me." Mark's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" The man stood, walking closer. "Emma didn't just fall into this. She was recruited. The money, the lies. It was all part of a much bigger plan. She was desperate, and I took advantage of that. But she's not the one you should be angry with." Mark's mind spun as the man spoke. This wasn't just an affair. This was something far darker, more calculated. Emma had been manipulated, used, and now, so had he. "You can walk away," the man said, his tone almost mocking. "Or you can stay and learn the rest. But trust me, Mark, the truth is much worse than you think." Mark stared at the man, his entire world crumbling around him once again. He had come seeking answers, but now he stood at the edge of something far more sinister. Without another word, Mark turned and walked out of the room, his chest tight with fear and anger. He didn't need any more of the truth. Some truths, he realized, were better left buried.